Hey everybody, this is Ryan McClanahan with HistoryThroughCards.com. I hope you're all doing very well today. So today I wanted to tell you a little bit about my favorite bands and albums through the 1968 and 1969 Panini Cantanti or Singers sets. Now, I don't own any of these cards, but there's a lot of collectors who want them on they're on their want lists, and I'm one of them. Very rarely do I ever get to see these things out in a show. The 1968 set consists of 345 cards, while the 1969 set has 389 cards. And both sets measure 1.5 by 2.5 inches. Interestingly enough, I had been doing research on these particular sets prior to the Boston Shiner show, which was a lot of fun, and I'll be talking more about that show in another video. When I showed up on Friday, I entered the show floor, turned my head, and there was this brightly colored poster with a big bird staring at me right in the face. As it turned out, it was an original Woodstock poster from 1969. So my first purchase at the baseball card convention was an iconic music poster. I think it was some kind of sign, to tell you the truth. I think it's pretty safe to say that we all love music to some sort of extent. And I have a question for you guys. In fact, when you look at a poster or an album or listen to a particular song, does it invoke a certain memory for you? When I saw that poster of Woodstock, I immediately thought about my dad and my uncle Mac. And if you guys listen to my or watch my videos, you'll see on the side there's a photo of my uncle Mac. And at some point, I've got to write a book about my dad and my Uncle Mac's adventures in Haight-Ashbury in the 1960s and what it was like to grow up around them and just listen to all sorts of crazy stories that they had. And this is kind of part of it, but I'm not going to go too deep into that in this video. Again, I think that is deserving of a book, and I am a little biased because it is my father and it is my uncle, and I grew up with them. But they had some amazing times back in the 1960s and 70s that if I share with people, they may think I'm crazy. There is a drug element to this as well. As I'm going through this, because some of the singers from obviously from 1968, 1969 are of Jimi Hendrix and that crowd from Haight-Ashbury, which is the same crowd that my father and my uncle hung around and knew pretty well. So that's something that I'm gonna kind of dance around right now just because I don't want to get too deeply involved in that. But getting back to the 1968 and 69 Panini Cantanti. I butcher the English language like Jacques Cousteau looked for shipwrecks. It's it's crazy. Anyway, someday I'll get that fixed. I can't tell you about my love of music without telling you about my dad and my uncle. For the record, when I write an article about a player or a set, I'm usually listening to the music from the era in which I'm writing about. So, for instance, if I'm writing about the 1922 American Caramel set, I'm listening to like 1920s jazz. Usually it's Bix Beiderbecke or Duke Ellington or Fletcher Henderson or Jelly Roll Morton or some combination of those guys. And there's a lot there from the 1920s that I really love. Unfortunately, there aren't really too many cards of big band leaders from the 20s or 30s or 40s, but there are a few out there. But anyway, I get kind of carried away with this stuff. Obviously, as you guys are gonna listen, yeah, you're gonna be like, dude, he's getting carried away again. Anyway, so if it's like the 1930s, it's usually I'm listening to Artie Shaw or obviously Glenn Miller, who's probably the greatest big band leader I've ever heard in my life. or the 1950s. So if I'm doing an article from like say 1953 Bowman or something, I'm usually listening to like the Platters or that kind of a band. I hate to say it, but when I think of the 1950s music, I think of one hit wonders. There aren't really like a group that I can think of outside of like the Platters that you have more than one hit. uh, I think it's kind of unusual, unless you're like maybe Elvis Presley. But I think he's later on. So like, I'm getting carried away again. But um, so like rock and roll really kind of started in like what 1953, 54, and Johnny Ace I think was like the first one. And well, you guys can read about Johnny Ace and what he did. Dumb bastard. Anyway, uh, this is what happens, guys. I start thinking about music. Anyway, so this really helps me in several areas. I'm usually trying to imagine myself what it's like to be in that era in which I'm writing about, and it really helps me in that capacity. Also, it's kind of setting the mood and the tone as well of the article. So I've always done this since I was really kind of a teenager. So this actually brings me to my introduction to music. As I've said, that my love of music really came from my father. One day I came across something really interesting, and it kind of changed my life musically. That is, because I always talk to you guys about my life really kind of changed when I went into a card shop for the very first time, and years later it cemented my role as a investigative journalist, if you will. One day I think I may have been in like the second or third grade. I want to say it was the third grade. That we used to have these book fairs, and you could get like maybe a couple of books for like 25 cents or so. I usually chose the science fiction stuff. Instead of doing a science fiction book, I saw a box of all records, and my dad had records. I really didn't listen to a whole lot of records, I don't think, until later on. And so and there weren't many of them that he had. It was just a small little, I don't even know if you want to call it a box, but I never really touched it because it was his. So anyway, I was flipping through this box of all these records, and I pulled one out, and it was, well, I hate to say this. It's so embarrassing. It was Barry Manilow. So anyway, and I thought, at the time, oh, Barry Manilow, he must be awesome. He's got a record, right? I mean, little did I know. Hey, we all make mistakes. Anyway, so I went home and I showed this to my dad, and he started laughing, and he shook his head, and he just kind of like walked away. And I at the time I was like, oh my God, what did I do wrong? Like what? Like I just didn't understand. I'm like 10 years old, and I'm bringing home a Barry Manilow record to my dad, who watched some of the greatest bands of all time back in the 1960s and knew some of these people. A few weeks later, I'm just screeching down the street, just running as fast as I can, and it's trash day, and that's actually one of my favorite days, trash day, because you never knew what you're gonna find in somebody else's trash, and I was kind of like the king of the dumpster divers back then. Anyway, this day was really special. I'm running down the street, in the corner of my eye, I see a bunch of boxes filled with albums. Now, I stopped and I had a choice to make: grab these boxes of records and be late and then get in trouble with, the teachers, my dad. Since we're talking about this, you probably can expect to know what I did next, right? So I grabbed all the boxes. I think there were about six or seven, and I dragged them home. I put them on the porch, and then I went to school, and I got busted by the teachers and all that fun stuff. I get home, and my dad asked me, "Where did you get all those records?" And I said, "Oh, our neighbors threw them out," and he's looking through them, and it's the Doors, it's the Grateful Dead, it's Janis Joplin, it's the Hondeliers, which I think were the Beach Boys. That one's kind of even weird for me today because it sounds like the Beach Boys, but it said Hondeliers, so I was always confused. Anyway, there was the Beatles, the White Album. There was Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. All these. Oh, there was there was Fats Domino. You're looking at the greatest albums of all time, and my dad was completely astounded. He couldn't believe it, and so he pulled out the record player, and we started listening to some of this stuff. And he's like, "I gotta tell you about some of these bands." And he started saying that when back when he was a kid, what happened was that he had actually graduated high school fairly early. I think he was 16 years old when he graduated in 68, and he went to get a job, and his first job was at a hospital. And the first day he showed up, he said he saw someone hanging from a tree, and apparently they had all killed themselves. So he was just like, "That's it, I'm out of here." And so at some point, as my aunt had said, that she was riding down a highway in California, and she was supposed to meet her cousin who was just getting out of the Navy, and they see this kid thumbing a ride on the highway, and it ended up being my dad. I mean, of all the crazy things, just happenstance, I guess. I never really believed in coincidences, but that was an amazing coincidence. Anyway, they were going to go see my uncle who was out in California at the time. So they went to see him. My dad ended up knowing like a bunch of these rock and rollers, if you want to call them that back then, these bands. My uncle did. He said that Janis could drink them under the table any day, and he had some other stories I'm not going to share here. There was a pretty big difference between my dad and uncle. My uncle was pretty open and honest about his his experiences in the 1960s and 70s, where my dad would never really kind of like be like, "Hey, like listen, like this would happen and this happened." He was more reserved, and I think there's a pretty good reason why he really didn't want to share his stories with me, because he didn't want me going down the same road that he did when he was a kid, and so I can respect that. At the same time, though, I really wanted to know what it was like for my dad growing up as a kid. He didn't really talk a whole lot about it. We had a really, at least I had a really good childhood, despite being despite being disabled, which is it's again it's not for everybody, but I don't know any different. So despite being disabled and despite not having a very good or adequate education, I had to create my own education, and it was through my dad that I did. And he really tried very hard to get me to to pay attention and to learn as much as possible. And I really kind of consider this also an education too, a music education. He really wanted me to kind of like explore different kinds of music, and if I liked something, just continue listening to it. And I've never really been a very good musician at all. I tried once or twice, but it just didn't stick. And the one thing that did stick was just listening to different kinds of music. And I also learned to through the music that I'm going to be talking about today. It kind of shows us an era in American history that really will never happen again. At least I don't think. I grew up in the 1980s and in the 90s. The music that I grew up with is a lot different from the music that my father grew up with. But the music that my father grew up with in the 1960s and the early to mid 1970s was more cultural than the music that I grew up with. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love, the music that I grew up with in the 1980s and the 90s, but there was a deeper meaning and impact culturally that the music of my dad's generation had on his generation, if that makes sense to you guys. I really wish I was a fly in the wall for Woodstock. Now I don't think he or my uncle actually ever went to Woodstock because they were on the other coast, but they definitely knew a lot of the quote unquote players involved, if you will, that went to Woodstock. So I kind of envy my dad and my uncle because they had front row seats to these musicians that I don't think a whole lot of other people did, other than roadies and whoever. And there's another really great reason why they knew these people like they did, and that's because, well, we had a little bit of a drug problem back in the 1960s. I know that's a shock. You're all shocked about that. I was pretty shocked too, to tell you the truth. I didn't want to believe it, but it was true. And I think there was also a culture shock too when it comes to the clothing styles of the 1960s and 70s too. That's another story for another time. But I think you'd have to have, drugs to, to wear some of that stuff. Anyway, getting on to this, there's a couple of musicians and bands and albums that I want to talk to you guys about today that actually are in these two sets. And as I say before, I don't have any of these cards, but I really want them. I was to add a couple to my collection. I have not had any luck with this over the last, I don't know, 5, 10 years or so. Maybe you guys could, but this is also interactive too, this video. So when I'm talking about some of these bands and these albums, you guys can go and listen as well. And then obviously I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about this stuff as always. Let me know what your favorite songs are, or bands, singers from the 1960s and maybe even early 70s. There are other bands and singers that do appear on Panini stickers later on in like 1972, and obviously in the 1980s. And there was the Panini Hit Stars, and I'm going to talk more about those sets in a different video. I think this is going to be a little bit long, but I think it's going to be really fascinating. So here we go. So let's talk about Jimi Hendrix for a few minutes. So Jimi Hendrix is a guitarist that I really didn't appreciate when I was a kid, and a lot of his songs I felt were really kind of abrasive, and I probably didn't listen to a lot of Jimi Hendrix because of that. But over the years, I've really like become a pretty big fan of his, and obviously he's got some really great songs out there. Purple Haze, I think everybody should listen to at least once. And then he's got another song called Red House. It's a real bluesy feeling with rock vibes to it. It's a real sleeper, I think. And the interesting thing about Red House is that a lot of people say that it's the inspiration for the place that he was living in Haight-Ashbury in the 1960s at 1524A Haight Street. Well, actually, there's a couple of problems with this. One of them happens to come from Peter Albin, who is the bassist for Janis Joplin, and in like 1967, he was introduced to Jimi Hendrix, who was at the Fillmore, and he said that Jimi Hendrix really didn't know the area very well, and so he took him on a tour of the city. He didn't know the city, and it turned out that Hendrix very rarely, if ever, spent a lot of time in Haight-Ashbury. So 1524 Haight Street is an address that he most likely wasn't at, and it looks like a rumor at this point. There's no real documentation that says that Hendrix parked himself at this address at any time. And the other fact is that in September of 1966, Jimi Hendrix left for England, and he was mostly in England from like 1966 to his passing in 1971. So, again, it's a great song, but I'm not entirely sure if the Red House in Haight-Ashbury was the one that he was referring to in the song. And then there's another song that he did, which I think you guys would really enjoy, called Hey Joe. And that's actually a cover by Billy Roberts. And Billy Roberts passed away in 2017, but he did this song and he wrote the song in 1962. And the authorship has been greatly contested over the years as well. And a lot of people have said that Billy Roberts, he may have copywritten this song, but he really didn't do a whole lot with it. I actually heard this song and I really like it. I think it's a great song that he did. The Leaves also did this song in 1965, and Jimmy turned it into a classic in October of 1966. And Robert's version is really fantastic. It's an acoustic version with just a guitar. And the Byrds also did this song in 1966 on their album Fifth Dimension. So while Hendrix was in London, he was spotted by Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, and he referred him to producer Chaz Chandler of the Animals. And you know that thing about Keith Richards, right? So what they say about him is that every time you smoke or drink, you take 10 minutes from your life and give it to Keith Richards. That's got to be true or something, because Keith Richards is still around, and he'll probably be around a lot longer than any of us. So at the time as well, in like 1966, Jimmy was performing under the name Jimmy James and the Blue Flames, and I listened to a little bit of this. He's got some songs from them that it sounds like Jimmy, but it's really odd. Like there's no Jimi Hendrix that we know of today. It's you guys can actually listen to some of his songs from the Blue Flames on YouTube. I'm gonna share a link down below so you guys can actually do that, and let me know what you think in the comment section below. So he did another song called "The Wind Cries Mary," which, along with "Hey Joe," "Purple Haze," are on his debut album "Are You Experienced?" And that was released in the United Kingdom on May 12th, 1967. The album is 30th on the list of 500 greatest albums of all time and is in the Library of Congress Nationally Recorded Registry as culturally and historically important. Another song I really enjoy is All Along the Watchtower, and Hendrix first heard it performed by Bob Dylan. He went to record his version and had Dave Mason do the acoustic guitar. Mason is best known for his work on Traffic, and a special shout out to Dave Mason. If you guys want, you can go to YouTube and check out Dave Mason live on XM Satellite Radio. I highly recommend this. In fact, I'm gonna send another link for this as well, because and I really recommend that you guys listen to his entire album here too, because that is just absolutely fantastic. It's one of my favorites. So Dave Mason was a backup guitarist for Jimi Hendrix on All Along the Watchtower, and he may have done a few other songs as well. There's another album that I recommend as well besides Are You Experienced, and that is Electric Ladyland, and that one's actually quite fantastic. So unfortunately, Hendrix died on September 18th, 1970, from an overdose of sleeping pills in London, England, at age 27. And there's a lot on Jimi Hendrix, and he doesn't have a whole lot of cards during his career. So I thought that this is really interesting. Like, if you wanted to collect cards of ball players during their career, as I do, I don't like to collect cards of ball players afterwards, so I don't have any autographed new modern cards. And the same thing would be true with bands and singers and stuff after their careers. So that's just me, though. Hendrix also played a few sessions with Eric Clapton of Cream, which I had no idea about. I would love to hear these. I wasn't able to get a hold of any of these sessions. Cream is a band that formed in London in 1966 with Ginger Baker, Jack Bruce, and Eric Clapton. And like Hendrix, Cream had a brief career. So Hendrix's career only lasted 4 years, while Cream lasted only three. But they were highly influential and entered the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1993. And Jimi Hendrix actually entered the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1992. And that actually might be the first year of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I have yet to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but I really plan on it at some point. So Rolling Stone has Cream at number 67 on their all-time greatest artist list. And their debut album, Fresh Cream, was released on December 9th, 1966, and features Spoonful, a really fantastic song, and Toad, which I don't hear a whole lot of, but that song actually showcases Ginger Baker's skill as a drummer. There are two versions of this album. It's about 18 to 20 minutes long, and I highly recommend it. But the songs I really enjoy come from Disraeli Gears, which has Strange Brew, and then I don't know, I never knew how to pronounce this. So it's SWLABR, Swalabar. I have no idea, but that's a really great song. And then Sunshine of Your Love and Tales of Brave Ulysses, which just blew my mind. It's a fantastic song, and it's just absolutely amazing. It's based on Homer's poem in the Odyssey, and I often replace the mermaids with 1914 Boston Garter, and you'll understand what I'm talking about when you listen to the song. Cream's White Room from their third album, Wheels on Fire, released in June of 1968 or November of 1968. I get conflicting reports on that. White Room is almost exact to Tales of Brave Ulysses, but Wheels on Fire is listed at number 205 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. The band broke up because Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce fought like the Hatfields and McCoys in 1968. Eric Clapton is widely regarded as one of the greatest guitarists of all time, also named number 5 on the 10 best electric guitarists in 2009. So when it comes to psychedelic rock and the decade that was the 1960s, I immediately think of Cream. The Moody Blues is another band that I want to tell you guys about. They were formed in May of 1964 in Birmingham, England. They consisted of drummer Graham Edge, guitarist and vocals Denny Lane, keyboardist Mike Pinder, Ray Thomas, and bassist and vocalist Clint Wardwick. Originally, the band was an R&B group that changed when Lane and Warwick left the band in 1966, and main vocalist Justin Howard came on board with John Lodge. I think it's really Howard who really made the band what we know of it today, with his distinct sound and psychedelics, with orchestra vibes as well. You definitely get that. You really get this also in their Days of Future Past album from 1967, featuring Nights in White Satin. You're going to really want to listen to the 9-minute extended version. It brings such wide range of emotion. The poem towards the end of the song is called Late Lament. It was written by Graham Edge and spoken by Mike Pinder, and it was released in 1967. So the song itself has a slow build up in the beginning, much like the Alan Parsons Project, I, Robot. And you may know that song from Ghostbusters. It's another great album as well. So I would recommend that. Also on this album is Tuesday Afternoon. This song was later released as a single in 1968. The studio version is 8 minutes and 23 seconds long, but it's well worth it. It's simply amazing. It really is a great song, like a daydream, really. The band went on hiatus in 1974 and came back in the 1980s with Your Wildest Dreams in 1986. I Know You're Out There Somewhere in 1988. Two really fun and great songs. Great storytelling, too. So Hayward still performs as far as I know. Graham was the last remaining original member. He passed away in 2021. The band sold 70 million albums, 18 platinum and gold. 16 albums made the US top 20, and the band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2018. They also greatly influenced ELO, Electric Light Orchestra. The Doors was a band that I always heard about from my dad, and it's one of the albums that I found in the trash, and my dad told me all about this. So the Doors were formed in Los Angeles or Venice in 1965, and I get two different versions of this, and I'm not sure exactly which one is correct. However, Jim Morrison was on vocals, Robbie Krieger on guitar, Ray Manzarek on piano and organs. I hope I pronounced Ray Manzarek's last name correctly. A lot of times I don't. I garble the English language pretty well. So John Densmore was on drums. And Morrison is a member of the 27 Club, unfortunately, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But over the years, many have wondered if he faked his own death. I'm not in that camp at all. I firmly believe that he died in Paris in 1971. I often wonder what Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and Jim Morrison would be doing right now had they survived. I think they would have made some amazing music, but you never know, And Jim Croce is another one, although I think he was older than 27. But it's just something about the number 27 and rock and roll, because there's a lot of people who didn't make it past 27 for whatever reason. I have no idea on that one. And it would have been fun to see how their music would have progressed. Morrison is often ranked as one of the greatest rock singers of all time, and his song Light My Fire, released in January of 1967. This is an amazing song, and it's the song that got the Doors banned from Ed Sullivan's show on September 17th, 1967. The lyrics, Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Higher, were to be changed, and Morrison sang the song unedited. And I actually asked my father about this, and he said that people were they were lighting cars on fire, and I couldn't believe it. He's like, everywhere you went, like people were just lighting stuff on fire and just creating havoc because of the song. It's considered one of the greatest songs of all time. And the funny thing is that Morrison and the Doors were not known to do any commercial endorsements during their time. One thing that I heard was that there was a deal with Buick in 1968 with Light My Fire. Jim Morrison found out about this, and he threatened to smash a Buick on live TV. So they cut the deal. The song is number 35 on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time. It's really difficult for me to choose which is my favorite song of the Doors. So I want to say that the album that I dived into the dumpster for was their Stockholm 68 tapes, which apparently had everything. And I really enjoyed LA Woman. It's growing on me more now than when I first heard it. And Whiskey Bar is not bad either. Love Her Madly is one of the greatest chart hitting singles at number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100. Billboard magazine is where I got a lot of my info on sports and non-sports card issuing companies over the years, since it dealt with amusement, film, and industries. This is really interesting because it's the last place that you would think that would have all that stuff in it, but that's originally what Billboard magazine was, and then it drifted into bands and songs and all this other stuff and the music industry. I actually recommend listening to the entire LA Woman album. I believe they came out in June of 1971. This was actually kind of interesting here too, that the Doors in 1969 were blacklisted from much of the radio airwaves, where Morrison was to be on trial in 1970. He was actually convicted in September 20th, 1970, after being charged with profanity and indecent exposure at a Miami concert. Shortly after the trial, they wrote love her madly, and Riders on the Storm and LA Woman. Riders on the Storm is a fantastic song. And so Riders on the Storm was the last song Jim Morrison recorded before his death. It's an amazing tune inspired by a country song, Ghost Riders in the Sky by Vaughn Monroe, who did a great version of Until the Lights Go On again all over the world from World War II. That's a fantastic song too. So you should find on YouTube a documentary that Ray Manzarek did explaining how he came up with the keyboard instrumental for the song. The name for the band, The Doors, by the way, came from Aldous Huxley, and he actually has a 1937 Will's famous author's card, which I actually have. So I'm a real big fan of Aldous Huxley. So another band that I really kind of grew up with was the Mamas and the Papas, and they formed in Los Angeles in 1965, consisting of John Phillip, Michelle Phillips, who is John's wife, and Denny Doherty, and they were really known as a folk rock band. But unlike, say, Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, I've always enjoyed their music. I tried to listen to Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, and I'm just not a fan. I can't get there for whatever reason. Dylan does have a real great quote, and it goes something like this: "When it comes to ass, grass, or cash, nobody rides for free." And I always use that. I think it's so true. So the thing is, like, both Baez and Dylan have been around for a lot longer than the Mamas and the Papas. So around 50 years. They're historically and culturally important, but the Mamas and the Papas really were a very different style-wise band than either of those singers. And really, it's I think because of Mama Cass. Their debut album came from 1966. If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears, which is ranked 127 on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time. In it, you'll find Monday, Monday, California Dreamin', and Go Where You Wanna Go. But I Call Your Name was written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, amazingly, and their version of Spanish Harlem was written by Phil Spector. And I think Phil Spector ended up dying in prison. You can look up his name. I think he killed his girlfriend or his wife. But anyway, the song was first performed by Ben E. King, who is with the Drifters. King, by the way, is in these sets and is noted for the amazing song Stand By Me in 1961 and again in 1986. Both times they were top 10 hits for those years, and the second time due to the movie Stand By Me, which, if you guys haven't seen Stand By Me, go and check that out. It's an amazing movie. King also has a 1975 song called Supernatural, and his original Spanish Harlem is in the rock and roll list of 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. Getting back to the Mamas and the Papas, now, Cass Elliot had a fantastic singing voice and, if you'll pardon the pun, a large presence. Her voice is very distinctive and makes a lot of their songs, tell you the truth. I think if it wasn't for Mama Cass, the Mamas and the Papas would not be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame today. Especially, California Dreamin', if you listen to that, that's a really fantastic song. She also did a solo of Dream a Little Dream of Me, which was recorded in 1968 in April, I believe. That original song is from 1931, sung by Ozzie Nelson. Oh my God, really? There are over 400 different recordings of this particular song. And I sampled a few of these, and Mama Cass' version is by far the best. This was their first major hit on the Billboard Hot 100 as the band broke up not long afterwards. I've also heard a couple of really odd things about John Phillips over the years, and I'm not going to mention them here, but Mama Cass had a successful solo career, but there's always this thing about her dying after choking on a ham sandwich in 1974. It's complete hogwash. She died at age 32 from heart attack after losing 100 pounds. She didn't diet properly, and so she got really sick and died. Michelle Phillips is the only band member still with us. And before I forget, listen to Creaky Alley. It's the story of the beginning of the band. They are a very interesting band, for sure. So I was really kind of surprised to see that the band was in these sets. So the next band that I want to tell you guys about is the Temptations, which make an appearance in this set. Having been one of Motown's biggest successes, I don't often get to hear their stuff anymore, but their lead singer, David Ruffin, was or is considered on par with Smokey Robinson, who also makes an appearance here. I always remember that the 1987 song by ABC, When Smokey Sings. That's another fun group I'll talk about later when I discuss my favorite bands of the 1980s. Getting back to David Ruffin, he's also on par with Marvin Gaye, who worked with him. So that was kind of interesting. They've got so many great songs, it's difficult to give you a rundown. Their first song from their 1964 album, entitled Meet the Temptations, has songs performed or written between 1961 and 1964. Their 1965 album, The Temptations, sang with Smokey with My Girl, The Way You Do the Things You Do. So Ruffin was replaced in 1968 with Dennis Edwards, quite frankly because Ruffin had a problem with the nose candy, and that's what later killed him in 1991. Edwards sang Ain't Too Proud to Beg, which I didn't know. When Edwards joined in 1968, 1969, the band started dabbling in other genres like psychedelic and funk. That's really interesting to me, but the latter I'm really into. I've always been interested in funk music, and I recommend listening to Cloud 9, which is amazing stuff. So the Temptations are often associated with Diana Ross and the Supremes, who my aunt saw, I believe, in a little dive lounge in Cambridge, Mass, like very early on. She has a photo of the three of them with Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Diana, and their autographs are on the back. So I did see this. I'm to tell you the truth, I'm a little on the jealous side that my aunt got to see the Supremes very early on. So she was very lucky, by the way. Anyway, the Supremes are also included in the last one of these sets. Unfortunately, there's another amazing group I never really dove into like I should have. I really didn't listen to a whole lot of Supremes. I always say, too, it's never too late to explore these bands and their albums. Diana Ross does have a great song called Love Hangover. I believe that's from like maybe the mid to late 1970s. If you do listen to this song, about 2 minutes and 45-second mark, it dramatically transitions. So if you do listen to the song, just hold on, because I know the first part of the song is like, what the heck is he doing? Like, this sucks. But no, it really is a good song. I really enjoy it. If I didn't know any better, I'd say Herbie Hancock had something to do with this. Herbie Hancock had a lot of great stuff. And if you want, listen to the extended version and check out Herbie Hancock's Tell Everybody, because that's a great tune. 1968 Love Child is such a great song. I highly recommend listening to it. The Temptations shouldn't be confused with the Four Tops, who was also in the set. I did that, actually. I confused the Four Tops with the Temptations, me being a dumb kid. Levi Stubbs was the lead vocals in that group, and they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1990. Stubbs is probably one of the best male vocalists of his era. You can hear how rich and passionate his voice comes through in Bernadette in 1967, which is my favorite song. They're also known for Baby, I Need Your Lovin', and I Can't Help Myself, Sugar Pie Honey Bunch. And, I thought that was two different songs, but it's the same song. It's the same old song as another great song. Reach Out, I'll Be There. But they also did a cover of Walk Away Renee in 1967, which was originally done by Left Bank in July of 1966. That original is unreal, if you guys haven't heard that. So the song, as keyboardist and writer for the band said, was about his infatuation with bassist Tom Finn's then girlfriend, Renee Fladden. The song is number 220 on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time. The Four Tops version charted higher than the Left Bank's version at number 14, but it makes more sense coming from the Left Bank than it does with the Four Tops. Walk Away Renee is not the only song that I can think of that was written specifically for another band member's wife or girlfriend. So I think you guys know exactly where I'm going with this one. And it happens to be Eric Clapton when he was with Derek and the Dominoes. In 1971, he wrote Bell Bottom Blues and Layla, and later on in 1977, he wrote Wonderful Tonight. He wrote these with Pattie Boyd in mind. And who is Pattie Boyd? Now, she's actually the wife at the time in 1971 of George Harrison, formerly of the Beatles. And these guys were really good friends going back to at least 1964, and they worked on each other's albums and collaborated quite a bit. So when at a party, Boyd and Clapton were in a backyard, and Harrison walked in and said, "Hey, what's going on here?" And Clapton said to him, "I'm in love with your wife." I can't imagine how embarrassing that must be. That probably would have gotten a punch from somebody, and probably deservedly as well. But Clapton and Harrison remained friends even after this. But Clapton, he didn't see Boyd for a couple of years after this. Harrison and Boyd had divorced by the time that Clapton actually asked Boyd to marry him, and they actually got divorced in like 1989. Layla, for example, is an amazing song. It is so good. It is actually number 27 on the 500 greatest songs list of all time. I don't know how long that Derek and the Dominoes lasted, but when I was a kid, I didn't know that Eric Clapton was the frontman for this band, and I'm like, wait a minute, this sounds a little familiar to me. Do I know the frontman here? Well, it ended up being Eric Clapton. That's a really interesting song. That's something that I really wanted to share with you guys. So with Bell Bottom Blues, I didn't make the connection that it was actually written for Pattie Boyd as well. Same with Wonderful Tonight. There's a song that really resonates with this generation that went to Woodstock, and it's A Whiter Shade of Pale. That Procol Harum actually didn't make it to Woodstock. One of the band members was having, I believe, his first child, so they didn't make it. A Whiter Shade of Pale made its debut on May 12th, 1967, and it was on the number one spot of the UK charts for 6 straight weeks. It was number 5 on the US Billboard Hot 100, and it is one of the most commercially successful songs of its era. It has sold more than 10 million copies, and it ranks 57 on the 500 greatest songs of all time list, and has been covered by over 1,000 artists. I actually haven't listened to any covers of this song. I don't think they would do the original any justice whatsoever, but that's just me. Now, there are songs that sound a lot better from cover bands and others who have covered the original, but in this case, I don't think that's the case at all. It was actually written by Keith Reid, Gary Booker, who is the lead vocalist for Procol Harum, and Matthew Fisher, who was the organist for the band. And in 2006, Fisher sued Brooker over copyright and authorship. So that was I guess, great dispute. The other two guys got acknowledged for the song, but Fisher didn't. So he ends up suing in like 2006, and he was awarded 40% of the royalties after 2005. There was something really interesting about this song that people have actually tried to figure out what it actually means. And I'm one of those guys. So in 2008, Brooker did an interview with Uncut Magazine, and he said, quote, "I was trying to conjure a mood as much as tell a straightforward girl leaves boy story. With the ceiling flying away and room humming harder, I wanted to paint an image of a scene. I wasn't trying to be mysterious with those images. I was trying to be evocative. I suppose it seems like a decadent scene I'm describing, but I was too young to have experienced any decadence then. I might have been smoking when I conceived it, but not when I wrote. I was influenced by books, not drugs." Kind of an interesting band that I like is the Spencer Davis Group, which was around from 1963 through 1969, and again in 1973 and 74, 2006 to 2020, when Spencer Davis had passed away in October of 2020. They have some great songs. Keep On Running, Give Me Some Lovin', which is an awesome song. Steve Winwood was 14 when he joined the Spencer Davis Group and left in 1967 to form Traffic with Dave Mason. Spencer Davis was never the same group again after that. The band's drummer, Pete York, isn't to be confused with the Monkees' Peter Tork. Different, I could see why people can get those two guys confused. Peter Tork was the band's keyboardist and their bass player. In their time, though, getting to the Monkees now, the Monkees got a lot of crap from the established rock and roll bands, singers, and Jimi Hendrix actually said they were just awful. Part of the problem was that Mickey Dolenz, Peter Tork, Michael Nesmith, and Davy Jones were essentially actors hired by Bob Rafelson, who pitched the idea of a sitcom surrounding a band called the Monkees in 1966. These guys really couldn't play, and they didn't write their own songs. Initially, the NBC wanted an already existing band. They initially wanted the Lovin' Spoonful, who are known for the song Do You Believe in Magic and Summer in the City. Not one of my favorite songs. That didn't happen, so they got actors instead. Nesmith was probably one of the most talented of the group. The group really did have to practice and put in a lot of studio time, but they still weren't ready for the deadline of the show's airing, so NBC brought in musicians to dub over on September 12th, 1966. Their first song, Last Train to Clarksville, written by Tom Boyce and Bobby Hart. I always loved this song, but I didn't know what the true meaning to Last Train to Clarksville was all about. And so years later, Hart later confirmed in a Song Facts interview that the Last Train to Clarksville was about a guy who gets drafted to go to Vietnam and asks his girlfriend to meet him at the train station in Clarksville, Tennessee, possibly for the last time. Clarksville was a common stop for soldiers on their way to Fort Campbell, Kentucky for basic training. This went right over the heads of the band, myself too, when I heard it as a kid, and many others at NBC. The song remains a classic and one of my favorites, as does Daydream Believer, Pleasant Valley Sunday, A Little Bit of Me, A Little Bit of You, and I'm a Believer, and I'm Not Your Stepping Stone, which I think is a real sleeper. Michael Nesmith's Mary Mary was covered by Run DMC, and I'm Not Your Stepping Stone was covered by the Sex Pistols, which is really kind of funny to me. Neil Diamond also wrote many of their songs. However, when they performed in front of a live audience, their pretend rock and roll band turned real. One thing the Monkees perfected was an onstage performance. They weren't trying to be anything they weren't, which I really appreciate. I think they were early pioneers of music videos that would be so popular when MTV came out. They sold more than 75 million albums worldwide. Their debut album, The Monkees, spent 78 weeks on the Billboard chart, 13 of which were number one. Despite all the controversies surrounding the band, they were one of the most successful of the era and are still very popular, especially among Gen Xers. I don't know about their potential Hall of Fame candidacy, but they are an important part of rock and roll history. If you can introduce older songs to newer generations, I think they would appreciate them as well. Another band that I've always enjoyed is the Dave Clark Five, consisting of Dave Clark, Dennis Payton, Mike Smith, Lenny Davidson, and Rick Huxley. They were the first band to follow the Beatles to the States, and in some cases rivaled that band with 14 top 20 hits, 8 consecutive. That's pretty impressive. Ed Sullivan must have been a really big fan because they were on his show more than anyone else. The band was formed in 1957 and broke up in 1970. Dave said that he no longer could perform as a drummer because he broke his knuckles in an accident. They released different versions of their albums in the United Kingdom and the United States, and same with their songs as well. Between 1964 and 1970, they released nearly 30 albums. In comparison, the Beatles put out 13 between 1963 and 1970. I don't think you can compare either band, honestly. This might get me shot in some parts of the country. I think the Beatles are overhyped and oversold. I'm not a big fan of the Beatles. I've tried. I really did. And I do like some of their stuff. Not everything. I think a lot of it is, trash. But, music is all about personal taste, and one man's trash is another man's treasure. And the Beatles obviously contributed greatly to rock and roll, but there's a reason Dave Clark became a multimillionaire. And Dave Clark 5 was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2008. Some of my favorite songs by them include Because, Glad All Over, Bits and Pieces, Red Balloon, Catch Us If You Can, which was the same song entitled after a film of the same name, actually, and released in the UK in 1965. It's different from Tom Hanks and Leonardo DiCaprio's flick Can't You See That She's Mine? And it sounds a little bit like the Beatles too. I was surprised to see Sergio Mendes make an appearance in the 1969 set. I didn't start listening to Sergio Mendes and the 066 until much later, in fact. He started playing in jazz clubs in his home port of call, if you will, Rio de Janeiro in the late 1950s, and moved to the United States in 1964. His sales at first were pretty slow until Lanny Hall, who is the vocalist singer on one of their greatest hits, Mas Que Nada, an amazing song. I highly recommend it. She just happened to be married to Herb Albert, who I'll discuss here a little bit in a moment. So they've had actually a couple of main singers here, female supports, and Sylvia Dulce Kleiner, and then Janis Hansen, then Karen Phillip. The band always went through a rotation of personnel. My favorite songs of theirs is Going Out of My Head. It's an awesome tune. Fool on the Hill is fantastic. Wichita Lineman, which I think Glenn Campbell did that song. Never Gonna Let You Go is another great song. The 1968 Look of Love, which Chris Bodie did, or Chris Bodie, I don't know how to pronounce his name. He did an amazing cover of that song, The Look of Love, with Chantal Krezovac on vocals, and Day Tripper, which is a cover of the Beatles song. Actually, in my opinion, I think Sergio Mendes' Day Tripper is a lot better song, much better. But you guys can check that out and let me know in the comment section below. As far as I know, Sergio Mendes is still actually performing with other A-list performers. So other than the Crosby, Stills and Nash studio album from 1969, so the funny thing about this album is that the band went back to do a reshoot of the photo for the album cover, and the house was gone. It was actually leveled, torn down, and it was located at 815 Palm Ave in West Hollywood. Anyway, I always digress here, but my dad had me listen to Herb Albert's Whipped Cream and Other Delights. I became an instant fan, or maybe it was because of the cover. That probably could be it. I highly recommend the song Taste of Honey, but the entire album is absolutely fantastic. Herb Albert and the Tijuana Brass, I think, is right up there with Benny Goodman, Ray Anthony, who at 101 is the last surviving member of the Glenn Miller Orchestra, and of course Louis Armstrong, who is in a class all by himself. However, Herb Albert was a co-founder of A&M Records along with Jerry Moss in 1962. Albert is the only musician that I'm aware of to have a #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 as a vocalist with This Guy's in Love with You in 1968, and as an instrumentalist in 1979 with his album Rise, or I think that's actually the song itself. I recommend that one as well. All right, so if we get back to the Temptations here, originally they did a song in 1971 called Smiling Faces Sometimes, written by Norman Whitfield, and it ended up #3 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song is supposed to have a studio version of 3 minutes, but all I was listening to was the 12-minute extended version. Apparently, it was covered by Undisputed Truth, who, if you haven't heard their version of California Soul, I really recommend that song. much more than the Temptations version. And then the Undisputed Truth did a song called Ball of Confusion, which was another Temptations song. So it looks like Undisputed Truth is stealing songs from the Temptations. But I actually really like both versions. I just kind of prefer the Undisputed Truth version of California Soul. I don't talk too much about it here, but Smokey Robinson has 26 songs that reached the top 10. The Miracles are probably one of the most covered bands in existence, to tell you the truth. Smokey is to Motown what Babe Ruth was to the Yankees. His songs, I heard it through the grapevine from 1967, is 80th on the 500 greatest songs of all time. But it was covered by Zapp and Roger, and their version is unreal. Marvin Gaye also covered it, and I can't talk about the Prince of Soul without mentioning Gotta Give It Up from 1977. Interestingly enough, Elvis Presley had a comeback in 1968 with Speedway. A song he did was Your Groovy Self, written by Lee Hazelwood, and he did a really odd song, at least I think, with Nancy Sinatra called Some Velvet Morning, which, if you were a fan of Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM, as I was, you'd be very familiar with this song. The song has a deeper understanding of the cosmos while you're on mushrooms, but I wouldn't know anything about that. Anyway, Elvis had some really great songs in the late 1960s. In the Ghetto is a really great song. Suspicious Minds, and in 1972, Burning Love. Elvis actually didn't die. He's in the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind boarding the UFO. I know that there's a lot more that I could cover here with the Rolling Stones, Wilson Pickett, Junior Walker, Stevie Wonder, and the comeback of Elvis Presley in 1968. But that's going to have to wait for another video. I'm not going to glorify the drug scene of the 1960s and 1970s. Obviously, there's, I think, a lot of damage that has occurred to the country and obviously the human mind because of it. I wonder if a lot of these songs would have been even possible if it wasn't for certain drugs being introduced. And it obviously has a huge impact on our culture. This is kind of like a side topic here, too, but have you noticed the difference in the country before JFK's assassination and then afterwards? Just a little thing to think about because there's definitely a change, just as there was a change prior to 9/11 and then afterwards as well. I think a lot of today's music just sucks over the last 30 years. There are some good music out there today. Most of it is just trash. But it also represents the era in which it was. Same with baseball cards, in fact. I really would like to thank my dad and my Uncle Mac for showing me the music that they grew up with and kind of teaching me all about it. And their stories are really incredible. As I said before, earlier on, that they did have a really interesting life, and I'm not really prepared right now to share that with you guys. That's something that's probably going to come out in book form, I think, and it's really kind of difficult for me. I've already shared what it was like with you guys for me being disabled as a kid in the 1980s and 1990s, and what sports cards have done for me personally in trying to ease my struggle, if you will, with being disabled and my education because of it. And I've already said that because of sports cards and the hobby, it has kind of erased a lot of the anger that I had towards the education system. And obviously, I'm a very big proponent of decent education, but I also feel that education is something that you can't really trust with just one person or one institution, and that you need to self educate, and it's going to be a lifelong experience and process. And this is one of those. Music is one of those. Music also is something that I think can shape and mold people for the betterment of mankind, really. And so I really thank my dad for introducing me to a lot of this music that he grew up with. My dad introduced me to big band as well, and big band is a lot different than this music is. And what I mean by that is that it gives off a different feeling, and I don't really know how to explain that. But with the 1960s music that he showed me. When I think of that music, or when I listen to that music, I think of what it was like for my dad and my uncle growing up in that time. And when I listen to big band music, I start to think about what it was like for my grandparents' generation and World War II and the Great Depression. And so I have a very different feeling towards big band music than I do for music of the 1960s and for music of my era, my generation in the 1980s, which I will be talking about. But oh, and then so there's funk music as well from the 1970s. That's all mine. That's all mine, Dad. I wish actually my dad had introduced me to funk music from the 70s, but he never did. So I got into that and I forget exactly how that happened. But man, there is nothing like funk music from the 70s. You know, Average White Band and the Fatback Band and the Ohio Players. I could go on with that stuff. I mean, that stuff is just absolutely fantastic. And if there are any cards of bands from the 1970s, I'll get there too, but I have to find them. And I know that there's a lot of bands that I didn't touch on this. Led Zeppelin, I know that they have a Panini card from 1972. The Grateful Dead doesn't have any cards that I'm aware of. And Janis Joplin, as big as she was in the late 60s at this time when Panini came out with these two sets, she doesn't have anything that I'm aware of. But I heard a lot about Janis Joplin from my uncle, and he knew her a lot better than my dad. I'm not entirely sure that my dad actually knew Janis Joplin. If he did, he kept it quiet because he didn't really talk a whole lot about the 1960s to me. He brought up some things, but I'm gonna divulge those in a book, I think, which I definitely think would help other people. Both of these guys had really amazing lives, but it also affected them, and it affected me too as well. So I'm not going to make light of the drug issue going on in the 1960s and 70s because it is serious, and it's as equally serious now. It's probably more serious now than it was back in the 1960s. I think that's something that I'm going to leave up to another time, and I don't want to get too bogged down or heavy into that, but it has affected that generation greatly, and as well as it's affected me as well. So anyway, guys, I'm gonna leave it here, and I'll probably come up with a few more songs and groups like the Rolling Stones because they are also in this set. They may have their own video, I don't know, but again, there's a lot more bands that I wanted to cover in this, but I didn't want to go too deep into this. There's a lot here for you guys to go over too, and just have fun with the music. So again, guys, thank you so much for stopping by. I greatly appreciate it as always, and I will talk to you later. Have a good one. Bye.
Never know when you'll be there again. Whatever the choice is, you can make it. You can take whatever's around the bend. Listen to your friend. It's just like deja vu all over. Deja vu all over. It's like deja vu all over again. It ain't over till it's over. Never know when the fat lady sings. A tumbleweed or a four-leaf clover. Never know what the future brings. all over. Deja vu all over. It's like deja vu all over again. Listen to your old pal Yogi. Let the wisdom come on through. He may say things a little funny. That don't mean they ain't true. Like 90% of the game is mental. The other half is physical. This old body's just a rental. So may your life be gentle on your mind, and you'll find that it's like deja vu all over. Deja vu all over. It's like deja vu all over again and again. It's like deja vu all over.